Another question that comes up is, why do you play the same riffs? Like every time we hear you playing something, you're playing these same songs. A lot of the stuff I play comes from a band called Fang. Um, and the reason I play the same riffs and don't need to really necessarily learn more riffs is because I know what those sound like. And they cover muffled tones, they cover harmonics, they cover power chords. And I've just noticed if I cover those ranges, that any kind of distortion I would build or overdrive or fuzz gets covered in that. And why not just test everything with the same couple riffs? And so when you look at it, I'm not much of a guitar player. That's obvious when you hear my samples. But you also know that you could pick up your guitar and probably play those same 3-4 chords that I play, and you would know what that sounds like. So that's another reason why I do that. Plus, I'd rather spend my time designing gear than learning a bunch of new songs. And occasionally I'll make a pedal. Like recently I made some pedals, and yeah, I came up with some new riffs. Of course, they sound very much like the Fang songs I play, but that's just part of the game. Not a guitar player. More of a guy who would, play with knobs. That's why I think I became an audio engineer. So that's kind of a brief history of the 90s. When we got around 2000, I came across the need to get parts because I wanted to start building these pedals for real, because I'd had enough people kind of bugging me about them and saying, hey, I want one of those pedals you make. And all through the 90s, I made versions of these pedals that didn't have the name Greedtone on them. And my friend Rob Skinner owned a record store, or a music store, and I called him up and I said, I would need to get these parts. Where do I get them? And so he gave me some ideas of where to get them. And I called those places, and they're like, well, do you have a business license? And I was like, well, no, I don't have a business license. And so I had to get a business license. So I called up my friend Ben Rue and said, I need a business license. And he said, yeah, I can help you with that. So we went downtown Seattle, and I remember the day we were walking down the street, and he goes, what are you going to call it? And I go, what do you mean, what am I going to call it? And he goes, what are you going to call the business? You have to have a business name. I go, I don't know. And he's like, well, you've had this history of this name Greed, Greedy, Greg. You were in a band called Positive Greed. Funny story is, when I was in grade school, me and a bunch of kids there started a little gang called the Greedies. And we would, splash kids at recess. You live in Seattle, you splash kids at recess. And so he said, it's got to be something to do with greed. And I spit out, a couple names, and they were horrible. And he looks at me and goes, what about Greedtone? And I was like, let's do it. So we went in, signed up. That's how Greedtone got the name.